Well, a week ago today, Sharon and I were finishing up rest. And we had the privilege of traveling with Laura and Luke, coming back from Pennsylvania. Also a chance to visit Sharon's parents and to spend one night with our daughter and her new husband, Andrew. Then later this week, we watched the tape of last Sunday. And Ron, I'm still thinking about your grandpa and the other preacher who came up to that puddle and couldn't decide what to do. Did they hear the voice of God, or was it just their own decision to go into the mud? How diligent we have to be to spend time with God so that we can hear the voice of God. For weeks now, we've been asking about rest. What does it mean to be restful? Already this morning I heard one person say, "Oh, I'm so tired." And there's probably more of us in here this morning that are saying the same thing. As soon as church is done, how about a nap? Well, that question has been going on for generations. As I prepared for this and read in Luke chapter 6, I was reminded of a story from years ago in Little House in the Big Woods, Laura Ingalls Wilder book. The story took place probably in the early 1800s because this is about Laura's grandpa, as her pa told her. In her grandfather's family, Sunday consisted of going to church, walking to church quietly, not talking, sitting very still in that hard pew for at least 2 hours, and the only thing you could do was look at the preacher. I like that idea. The only thing you could do was look at the preacher. And then following that, there was a cold noon meal prepared on Saturday, and after that, the afternoon was spent in Bible reading and prayer and study. Quiet. So the story goes that one fine January afternoon, the conditions outside were just perfect for sledding. And Laura's grandpa and her two brothers, the night before, had just finished building the perfect sled. Didn't have time to try it before dark. So all they could think of all through Sunday morning when they were looking at the preacher was the new sled that was up in the shed. And when they ate their cold lunch, all they could think of was the new sled that was up there waiting to be used. And then as they sat studying their Bible lessons, they heard the sound that they had been waiting for. Dad sleeping. Father had moved into that rhythmic snoring. And three boys, one by one, headed out of the room. Wes, I think there's a picture of that. One by one, they snuck out of the room on Sunday afternoon. Because certainly there was time while Dad slept for one run down the hill. Now, I failed to mention that the road outside of their house was the perfect sledding place. All the sleighs and buggies had been going by, and it was the perfect place for that new sled. Out they went to the shed. They grabbed the sled. They went up to the top of the hill. Now, it's Sunday, so they made no noise. They got on the new sled, all three of them, and they headed down. Now, normally they would have been whooping and yelling, but it's Sunday, and they don't want to wake Father up. As they go down the hill, the sled goes faster and faster until it's exhilarating. But about that time, a pig walks out of the woods and stands in the middle of the road. And the boys try to lean one way and lean another way to avoid the pig, but they just can't. And poof, There's the pig on the front of the sled. I think there's a picture of that, Wes. And you can see the pig's mouth is open going, "Rah!" And about then they flash by the house, and there's Dad, Father, standing in the doorway, watching them go by. At the bottom of the hill, they quietly get off the sled. The pig runs off, and they return the new sled back to the shed where it will remain for many, many, many days, and quietly go back in to the living room and resume their Sabbath rest. Jesus looks at the crowds around him and declares, Sabbath gives life. Jesus looks at you and I and says, Sabbath gives life. Luke has often had Jesus in the synagogues teaching on the Sabbath day. In Luke 6, Jesus and his disciples are walking through the grain fields. I imagine a small meandering footpath with the grain easily accessible, wheat, barley, rye. And as the disciples feel the hunger in their tummy, they reach over and grab a head of grain, shell it in their hands, pop the kernels in their mouth. Of course, the Pharisees are there, and they say, that's harvesting and threshing. That is not allowed on the Sabbath. Jesus' response is that David, who was not an authorized person, even with his soldiers, went into the temple and ate consecrated bread only for the priests. And Jesus responds with the words, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, thereby declaring the Sabbath gives life. On another Sabbath, Jesus heals a man's shriveled hand. It's against the rules to heal on the Sabbath. Yet Jesus declares the Sabbath gives life. So here we have it, folks. What we've been looking for, what we've been waiting for. In our desire to find out what is rest, an entire day to rest. And most of us are saying, oh, I only wish. But in God's plan, as Brad already mentioned, and Sharon mentioned in children's time, these days of work and then a day of rest. So what has become of today, of this day, that is not so much sometimes restful? And I'm making an assumption there. And yet I think there's some truth to it. In the Jewish tradition, it was called Sabbath. And in the Hebrew language, it meant to stop. To stop. The Jewish Sabbath began at sunset on Friday and concluded at sunset on Saturday. In the Old Testament, Exodus 20, verse 8, in the Ten Commandments, it says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. There's more things in there, and then He, God, rested on the seventh day. If you go on, so that's thinking about creation and how God created for 6 days and then rested on the seventh. But then if you go on in Deuteronomy 5:15, we're told, observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And then a few phrases later, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. God had brought freedom to the slaves in Egypt. You see, slaves never get rest. Slaves never get rest. Freed people do. Come back to that in a little bit. So in this whole talk about rest, the question comes, and Brad already alluded to it, what is work? And what is rest? Now, as pastor, it would be fun to put up a bulletin board and start writing down everything that you will not do on Sunday. Wouldn't that be fun if I got to say that? I think there'd be a lot of unhappy people. And I'm not sure that we would be fulfilling what God really has in mind for rest. The learned Jewish scholars defined work with hundreds of laws and rules. And that's where Laura's grandfather stepped over the line, because there were clear rules there. And these are the same kind of rules that Jesus is breaking in this passage in Luke 6. But we don't talk about the Sabbath in our Christian tradition. We talk about Sunday. After Jesus was resurrected, Christians took the idea of rest and moved it to the first day of the week to celebrate Christ's resurrection, but also to rest. That was helped along by a Roman emperor named Constantine, who in 321 declared to the Roman world that on Sunday you will rest. And in some of the discussions we have about secular versus Christian, this Christian practice of rest and our 7-day week has endured even up till now. Can I sled on Sunday afternoon? Sandy's saying, sure. Well, the list goes on with those kinds of questions. So if we think of Sunday as a time for rest and life, where does that bring us to? And let me go back to a phrase I said just a little bit ago. We can only rest if we are not enslaved. If I am a slave to anything, and I would say I have a tendency to be a workaholic, then I will not find rest on any day, let alone on Sunday. If I am addicted to reading or my phone or whatever else you want to put in there, I am in bondage, I'm still back in Egypt, and I will not find rest as God calls us to rest. The Sabbath, Sunday, should give life. Here are some of my thoughts about rest and life on Sundays as I have read these scriptures. The first one, relationships with God and others. R is for relationships with God and others. Sunday is a day when we stop and pause to worship God. We worship throughout the week, but most of us worship on the run. Sunday becomes that time when we can stop and worship. That's what we're doing here today, this morning. Worship put God at the center of our lives and pushes ourselves back somewhere else where it should be. With God at the center, we can give Him our burdens and our worries. Part of the reason we rest on Sunday and part of the reason we have a relationship with God is so that we can be yoked with God, so those burdens that come are easy and light. Sundays are also about relationships with people. Interacting with our biological and our spiritual families. playing with our children. And yes, I think Father should have gone down there and gotten that sled, let the pig go, and been the fourth one on that sled coming down the hill. Relationships with neighbors, with friends, visiting those in nursing homes or hospitals. All of those are ways that the Sabbath gives life. And that's not an exhaustive list. Those are some thoughts. R is for relationships, God and people. E is for eating. Now, I was a little desperate to figure out something for E, I have to confess that. But as I read some other things about Sabbath rest and Sunday, it talked about the power of gathering around food. And so really the eating feeds into the relationships with God and others. Make Sunday a time to call people together around food. Everybody seems to like to eat. And as you're together, fellowship and share and be together. I don't know how to answer the question of somebody has to prepare the food. I don't have an answer to that one. Some people enjoy making food. So we're coming to your house today at what time? There's fresh apple crisp in the fridge. Use food to enhance and strengthen the relationships with other people. That might even be and say, hey, let's go hang out at Subway. Let's go to B-Dubs tonight. Watch the football game. But the focus is on being together and celebrating the relationships we have. And we can use food to do that, eating together. S is for stopping. Sunday is about stopping the activities we do all week long and having a different routine. Sunday should have a different routine from the rest of the week. Most of the week, I eat a little bowl of cereal with milk. On an odd day, maybe a piece of toast. But Sunday mornings, Sharon has bagels out, and I eat a bagel. And Sharon lights a candle on the table that reminds us today's a different day. There's not a candle on the table any other time. Sunday noon can be all sorts of things, but somewhere in the afternoon, there's time to sit down and read the newspaper or look through the Farmers Exchange. Maybe watch a football game. I don't do that the rest of the week. Sunday evening, toasted cheese and ice cream. And I make it. It only takes about 45 seconds, so it's pretty good. And that ties into the eating together. Part of the reason on Sundays that we need to have some different routines is that we don't have to start every Sunday morning saying, it's Sunday, what are we going to do today? Well, go to church, eat with your family. What are the routines that invite you to rest? It's all about stopping. So what do you think T is? R-E-S-T, rest. T is for, T reminds us to think about where God is. Sabbath is having enough time to think about what has been going on in your life. To stop from the rigmarole of the rest of the week and say, God, what are you doing? Or even, God, what will you do in the coming week? A time to stop and take account of what is going on in your life. God, what have you been doing in my life? What are you doing in the life of the people around me? God, what are you calling me to? A time to stop and think about how God and other people are inviting you to live your life. You see, when you think back on what you will do today, will you be able to say that I rested and I gave life? Not only to myself, but to the people around me. Because the Sabbath and our Sunday, the intention is that we would know rest and that we would know life. Now, I know we don't always get it right all the time. But I think it would do well for us to stop and remember what God intends with this day that we are given. And to make choices about rest. Relationships, eating together, stopping with new routines, and thinking about where God is in our lives. Jesus, in Luke 6, isn't concerned about the Sabbath rules because Jesus declares that our Sundays should give us life. They should give us R-E-S.